Well, hello and welcome to another week of Adult Sunday School here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. We are continuing in our study of the book of Acts as we follow the followers of Jesus after Jesus' ascension. We're coming up on the end of this study that we've been doing. We're on Acts chapter 24 now, and we've only got 4 more weeks to go until we reach the end of the book. And that'll be on Palm Sunday. That'll be the last adult Sunday school for this year. So what have we been seeing? We've seen Jesus ascend into heaven, the Holy Spirit come. We've seen the good news about Jesus spread throughout the countryside. We've seen a man named Saul meet Jesus on the road while he's going to persecute Christians, only for him to then become Paul, a very passionate preacher of the gospel. Now, Paul has been going around the Mediterranean region, and now he's back in Jerusalem. Or rather, he went back to Jerusalem. He got arrested in Jerusalem for inciting a riot that he didn't actually incite. The commander of the garrison found out that he was a Roman citizen and tried to find out why everyone was so mad at Paul and brought him before the Jewish ruling council to try to find out. That council meeting turned into a screaming match, and so Paul went back in the garrison, and then the commander, Claudius Lysias, finds out about a plot against Paul's life. So the commander sent Paul up the coast to Caesarea, to the Roman capital, and into the custody of Antonius Felix, the Roman procurator of Judea. And then Felix summoned Paul's accusers to hold a trial for Paul there in Caesarea. And that's where we pick up our reading today in Acts chapter 24. We are going to see the folk from Jerusalem get to Caesarea and then find out what happens at Paul's trial. So, chapter 24, verse 1. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. They pressed charges against Paul before the governor. After the governor summoned Paul, Tertullus began to make his case against him. He declared, "Under your leadership, we have experienced substantial peace, and your administration has brought reforms to our nation. Always and everywhere, most honorable Felix, we acknowledge this with deep gratitude. I don't want to take too much of your time, so I ask that you listen with your usual courtesy to our brief statement of the facts." Tertullus is buttering Felix up at this point. He's already trying to make Felix feel good, telling Felix how great he is, the great things that Felix has done for the people. This is appealing to Felix's pride and his rather corruptible nature. Felix is someone who really liked bribes, and I wouldn't be surprised if there might have been some under-the-table dealings going on here, especially with what we find out at the very end of this section of Acts. But Tertullus is just really kind of playing up Felix here to make Felix more likely to rule for them. But now he's going to get into the meat of why they're there. What are the charges against Paul? So verse 5. "We have found this man to be a troublemaker who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the empire. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene faction and even tried to defile the temple. That's when we arrested him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to verify the allegations we're bringing against him." And the Jews reinforced the action against Paul, affirming the truth of these accusations. So Paul's charges are: 1, he started a riot. 2, he's a leader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And 3, he attempted to defile the temple. Well, starting a riot, he did. I guess technically he was the cause of a riot in Jerusalem. I wouldn't say he started the riot, but someone else started a riot because of him. So, maybe. And riots do seem to follow Paul around. I mean, they said that how did they put it? He stirred up riots among all the Jews throughout the empire, and that isn't inaccurate. Riots kind of follow Paul around. But, okay, probably not, like, he didn't really start them, though. He just was rioted at. And then as a leader of the sect of the Nazarenes, sure, he'll even admit this in a little bit. This is actually the first time that Christians are called Nazarenes, or followers of this guy from Nazareth. It makes sense. A lawyer for the Jewish ruling council wouldn't call this group of people Christians, because that would mean acknowledging that Jesus is the Christ, and that's not something that they do. So it kind of, if they imply that Jesus is the Messiah, then their case isn't exactly helped by this point. So they call them the Nazarenes, followers of this guy from Nazareth. Felix would also probably be vaguely aware, and we do find out later in this chapter that Felix is more than vaguely aware of Christianity. And so Felix, as part of his position, would be aware of a certain insurrectionist from Nazareth that was executed by Pontius Pilate about 30 years earlier. Executed with, of course, the crime of being king of the Jews. So they're kind of playing this whole angle of like Paul is a successor to a known traitor to Rome. So that one's fair. And then attempted defilement of the temple brings up the reason why the riot in Jerusalem started, that Paul was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple area, or at least trying to bring a Gentile into the temple area, which would have been considered a big no-no. Now, if you were paying attention, you might have noticed that we skipped verse 7. It goes 5, 6, 8, 9. That's not normally how we count things, but you might see in your Bible that there's a footnote that says something like, early manuscripts do not contain such and such parts of these verses. And it just so happens to be the second half of verse 6, verse 7, and the first half of verse 8. And it reads, "We wanted to put him on trial according to our law, but Lysias the commander arrived and took him from our hands with great force. Then he ordered his accusers to appear before you." Now, all of that is accurate, but it's not really giving Felix any information that he doesn't already know. It does kind of refute something that Paul says later, and Felix doesn't seem to care about this at all. But because it's not in the earliest copies, which are considered closest to the originals, it's not in the Bible now. That's generally the thinking when it comes to the stuff called textual criticism, that the earlier you can date something, the more accurate to the original that we don't have is. And verse 7 is, and those bits of the other verses are just not in there. Now, this is fine. We want to be as close as we can get to those original documents. And so we trust that earlier documents are going to be closer to those originals. And that's why this verse is here, or why this verse isn't here, rather, and it ends up in a footnote, because it doesn't really give any extra information. It doesn't explain anything more clearly about the situation that the involved parties already know, and it wasn't in those early manuscripts. And so it gets left out. And we've seen this in a couple other places where verses just don't show up. And it's nothing to be worried about. It's just part of the study of the Bible to find the most accurate copy, because these are 2,000-year-old documents. And so we're trying to get to as close to the original as we can get, because that's what we want. But back to the trial. So the prosecution now has made their case. The lawyer to Tertullus has offered the reasons why Paul should not be out and about in society. So what does Paul have to say? Let's find out. Verse 10. The governor nodded at Paul, giving him permission to speak. He responded, I know that you have been judge over this nation for many years, so I gladly offer my own defense. You can verify that I went up to worship in Jerusalem no more than 12 days ago. They didn't find me arguing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd, whether in the synagogue or anywhere else in the city. Nor can they prove to you the allegations that they are now bringing against me. So Paul's defense is now starting out with, I only got to Jerusalem 12 days ago. And for 5 of those days now, he's been in Felix's custody. So he's not going to be able to organize a riot in that time. I mean, he gets to Jerusalem, he does the 7-day purification ritual, then he gets arrested, and then he now is hanging out with Felix. That's not a lot of time. And of course, he argues he just went to the temple to worship. He had some, which we know, he had some purification rituals that he was advised to do by the other Christians in Jerusalem. And to top it all off, they don't have any proof. But then Paul, as I said he'll do a bit ago, he's going to admit to one of the charges. Verse 14. I do admit this to you, that I am a follower of the way, which they call a faction. Accordingly, I worship the God of our ancestors and believe everything set out in the law and written in the prophets. The hope I have in God I also share with my accusers, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. On account of this, I have committed myself to maintaining a clear conscience before God and with all people. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring gifts for the poor of my nation and to offer sacrifices. When they found me in the temple, I was ritually pure. There was no crowd and no disturbance. But there were some Jews from the province of Asia. They should be here making their accusations, if indeed they have something against me. In their absence, have these people who are here declare what crime they found when I stood before the Jerusalem council. Perhaps it concerns this one statement that I blurted out when I was with them. I am on trial before you today because of the resurrection of the dead. So Paul's defense is more or less, this is a Jewish religious matter and not really something for Rome to have to decide. I mean, he's identifying himself quite a bit as a Jew here, someone who is ritually poor, someone who is bringing gifts to the poor of Judea. He's saying that he is a good Jewish boy who happens to follow who he calls the good Jewish Messiah. And this is just a debate about the resurrection of the dead and not something that a Roman procurator needs to concern himself about. This is a Jewish issue for Jewish people in Jewish courts. That's all this is. It's actually not a bad argument. I mean, arguing jurisdiction is always a good choice when you're in court. You want to make sure that you're in the right place. And Paul is saying, yeah, this isn't the right court for this. Felix, I respect you. You've done a great job, but this isn't something you need to concern yourself with. We'll sort this one out on our own. I kind of think that at this point, Paul wants to go to Jerusalem. So he's thinking, sorry, he doesn't want to go to Jerusalem. He was just in Jerusalem. He wants to go to Rome. And at this point, he's thinking, I need to get all of this Jerusalem stuff dealt with so I can go to Rome. So if he can just get this no longer on Felix's plate, he can go free, get on a ship, and go to Rome. No big deal, right? Wrong. So Felix, here's verse 22. Felix, who had an accurate understanding of the way, adjourned the meeting. He said, when Lysias the commander arrives from Jerusalem, I will decide this case. He arranged for a centurion to guard Paul. He was to give Paul some freedom, and his friends were not to be hindered in their efforts to provide for him. So Felix's solution here is basically to put off making a decision. He says, oh, well, when Claudius Lysias gets here from Jerusalem, then we'll make a decision. Now, as far as we know, Lysias never shows up. There's no recording of Lysias showing up. So here we are. But Paul gets locked up in a pretty cozy way. I mean, he's got a pretty high-ranking person in charge of his guard. His friends are allowed to come and see him. He's given a good amount of freedom. He just is still locked up. But I think there's this interesting line that Felix has an accurate understanding of the way. And I don't think that means at all that Felix is a Christian. I think it just means he's a moderately useful governor in that he's aware of the religious things happening in his jurisdiction. So he knows about the stuff around Jesus. He's probably had interactions with James. A thing we know from Josephus is that everyone liked James the Just. So this is something that he would at least be functionally aware of, these religious currents. And it says that he understood what was really the issue. That, one group says that this Jesus guy was the Messiah, and the other group says that this Jesus guy isn't the Messiah. It's actually pretty straightforward when you really think about it. But here we are. So Felix has Paul imprisoned, but only kind of. I mean, after all, he is a Roman citizen and he hasn't been found guilty of anything. So verse 24, after several days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and summoned Paul. He listened to him talk about faith in Christ Jesus. When he spoke about upright behavior, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became fearful and said, "Go away for now. When I have time, I'll send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him some money. So he often sent for him and talked with him. So Felix's wife, we find out now, is Jewish, and her name is Drusilla. Drusilla is Herod Agrippa II's sister, and Herod Agrippa I, who we met several chapters ago, his daughter. Interestingly enough, this is Felix's second wife, and also his second wife named Drusilla. His first wife was Drusilla from Egypt. I don't remember her exact name. I forgot to write it down. And Felix was really liking the things that Paul was saying about Jesus. Right up until Paul started talking to him and affected the stuff that he really liked, namely corruption and excess. Things that are the opposite of upright behavior, self-control, and things that might be threatened by a coming judgment. So, of course, Felix is not going to want to hear those things. But then every so often, Felix would call Paul in and be like, "Hey, how you been? How you doing? You got anything for me? You got a little something? I can maybe help you out if you give me a little something." Because Felix liked bribes, remember. Very corrupt guy, Felix. Now, there is a weird little bit of trivia that I find interesting, so maybe you will too, about Felix and Drusilla's son, Marcus Antonius Agrippa, who died in AD 79 when Mount Vesuvius erupted. This is interesting to me because when I was a kid, I had a book that I got in school book club that basically was all about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and I thought it was really interesting. And so there's just, random little fact that you can pull out of your back pocket if you ever need a random fact about a slightly obscure Roman procurator in the 1st century AD. I don't know why you'd ever need that random fact, but now you know it just in case. But so here we are. We've got Paul, who is chatting on and off with Felix, and what happens next? Well, verse 27. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And since Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. Oh, well, that's a long time. 2 years of sitting in Caesarea doing probably not much, but talking to Felix occasionally and getting stuff, like having some freedom, but not a lot of freedom. Interestingly enough, this 2-year bit does tell us with some decent certainty when all of this is occurring. Felix was recalled in either 59 or 60 AD. So that means that Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea from 5758 to 5960, depending on when exactly all this landed. Part of the difficulty is the years don't quite line up as nicely as we'd like them to, but that's really neither here nor there. Felix's recall, as it was after the people of Caesarea appealed to Emperor Nero because of Felix overly harshly putting down a riot in Caesarea. He could have actually faced some pretty severe consequences for this, but his extremely powerful brother, Antonius Pallas, was able to get him out of it, and he died a couple years later in pretty much obscurity, most likely from tuberculosis. And then he was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but it says as a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. He never got the bribe that he wanted from Paul, so he didn't get anything from Paul, and Paul made him uncomfortable, so he scores some points on his way out the door after, again, getting in trouble for harshly suppressing a riot in Caesarea. So to score some points on his way out, to maybe get himself out of a little bit of the trouble he was in, he leaves Paul in prison. And next week, we'll find out what happened to Paul under Porcius Festus's rule of Judea. And he gets a little bit more impatient after now being in Caesarea for 2 years under arrest, because he's still not gone to Rome, and the Spirit told him to go to Rome. So it's going to get a little interesting, but we'll find that out next week. So if you have something to add to the discussion or any comments about what we talked about today, any questions, leave them in the comment section down below this video, and we will see you next week. And until then, God bless.